Snow fell red over the broken battlements of a dead city, and a single gray-haired swordsman knelt at the center of the ruin, his blade buried point first in the ash, his breath fogging weakly while monsters the size of houses circled the crater that had once been a kingdom. He was the last living thing on that field, and he knew it. The silver glint in his pale eyes had dimmed to something tired and final, and around his boots lay the shattered armor of every comrade he had failed to save when the rift in the world tore open and never closed again. Kale Varen had killed more of these creatures than any man alive, and still it had not been enough. And as a towering shape unfolded its jaws above him, he did not raise his sword, because there was nothing left in his arms but the memory of 40 years of swinging it. The jaws came down, and in the half-second before they closed, he thought not of glory but of a single regret. A sealed gate in a cliffside school where, decades ago, a careless boy had walked past a warning he could not read, and then the world went white and silent and cold. He woke screaming into a thin straw mattress, his heart hammering a young man's frantic rhythm, and the first thing he saw was a low stone ceiling stained with damp, and the gray morning light of a place he had not seen in 4 decades. His hands flew up in front of his face, and they were small, unscarred, soft-knuckled, the hands of a half-starved 16-year-old, and the breath left him in a rush as he understood, with a horror sharper than any wound, exactly where and when he had returned. This was a dormitory cell in Velgard Sword Academy, the fortress school carved into the black cliff above the storm-gray sea, and the boy whose body he now wore was the weakest cadet in the lowest rank, mocked, beaten in the duel circle, and destined to die forgotten. And Kale remembered every cruel year of it. He sat up so fast his vision swam, and through the narrow arrow-slit window he saw the towers of Velgard rising like upturned blades against a bruised dawn, and the sight that had once meant only misery now struck him like a thunderclap, because he knew what those walls would one day fail to hold. For a long moment he simply pressed his small palms flat against the cold floor and shook, not from fear of the cadets who would torment him, but from the impossible arithmetic of it. He had died an old man and woken decades in his own past, with all his battle memory intact and none of his body's hard-won strength. The phantom of a thin white scar itched across his left palm, a wound he would not actually receive for another 2 years, and he stared at the unbroken skin there and made himself a quiet, savage promise that this time the story would bend to him and not the other way around. A bell tolled somewhere high in the cliff, its bronze voice rolling down through the stone, and the sound dragged him out of memory and into the cruel present, because that bell meant the lower cadets had 4 minutes to reach the sunken training yard or be flogged for lateness. He stood on legs that buckled under him, this frail borrowed body refusing the commands his veteran mind gave so easily, and he gripped the edge of the bunk and breathed through the wave of weakness, learning in an instant the first hard lesson of his second life. Knowing how to fight was not the same as being able to. He pulled on the gray cadet's tunic with its frayed cuffs, and the plain hemp rancord that marked the very bottom of the academy, and as he laced the worn leather boots his eyes moved across the cramped cell, cataloging it with the cold efficiency of a man who had survived 1,000 ambushes. Out in the corridor the other lower cadets jostled past him, broad-shouldered farm boys and hungry second sons, and one of them shoved Kale's shoulder hard enough to spin him into the wall, laughing at the runt who could barely stand, and Kale only watched the boy go, filing the face away without anger. He climbed the endless stone stair toward the lower yard, the cliff dropping away on his left into churning gray surf far below, and with each step the salt wind tore at his thin frame and his lungs burned, while above him the academy's tiered yards waited like the rungs of a ladder he had once been too broken to climb. The lower yard opened before him, a sunken ground of cracked flagstones ringed by stone benches, and 100 cadets had already formed their ragged ranks under the gray sky, their breath steaming, their practiced swords held with the clumsy confidence of children who had never truly bled. On the raised dais at the yard's edge stood instructor Sarah Dolan in her black coat with crimson piping, silver blonde hair scraped into a tight braid, the hooked scar on her cheek catching the dawn light, and her hawkish amber eyes swept the assembled cadets with open contempt for their softness. Kale slipped into the lowest rank at the back, and the moment her gaze passed over him, he felt the old, familiar weight of being seen as nothing. But where the boy he had been would have flinched and looked away, the swordsman inside him met her eyes for half a heartbeat before lowering them, and something in her braid-framed face tightened. She barked the morning drill, and the yard filled with the clatter of wooden blades as the cadets ran the basic forms, and Kale lifted his chipped practice sword and felt the wrongness of it instantly. The boy's grip was wrong, the stance too narrow, the shoulders bunched, every habit a recipe for a quick death he had personally watched 100 soldiers die from. He could not yet make this weak body perform the master's forms he remembered, so he did something stranger and far more dangerous for a runt to do. He simplified, stripped stripping his movements down to the 3 motions a beginner could survive on, and he executed those 3 with a quiet, economical precision that belonged to no first-year cadet alive. From the dais, Sarah Dolan's eyes narrowed, because the smallest cadet in her yard was not flailing like the others. His footwork was minimal and correct, his guard recovered to exactly the right line, and though he was plainly too weak to strike hard, he was doing nothing wrong. And in 20 years of teaching, she had never seen a beginner do nothing wrong. She descended the dais steps with the slow, deliberate menace of a closing door, her coat snapping in the sea wind, and the entire yard went silent as the cadets realized the harshest. Instructor Envelgard was walking straight toward the runt at the back, and Kale's pulse quickened with a wariness no 16-year-old should possess. She stopped before him, a full head taller, and demanded in a flat voice who had taught him to stand like that. And Kale, keeping his eyes down and his answer short, said only that he had watched and copied his betters. A lie smooth enough to deflect, because the truth would have seen him drowned in the undervaults as a sorcerer. For 3 slow breaths she studied him, the scar pulling at the corner of her mouth, and then she struck. A sudden flat-bladed slash at his head meant to test whether his correct stance was luck or instinct, and Kale's body, weak as it was, moved on 40 years of reflex, and turned the blow aside by a finger's width, and the whole yard gasped. Sarah Dolan froze with her sword still extended, amber eyes wide, because no lower cadet had ever read that strike, let alone answered it, and in the ringing silence Kale realized his terrible mistake. He had shown a fragment of the swordsman, and now the most dangerous woman in the academy was looking at him as if she had glimpsed something that should not exist. She lowered her blade slowly, and instead of the rage he expected, she gave a thin, hungry smile, and announced to the stunned yard that this runt would duel the rank's top cadet at noon. And as the cadets erupted in disbelieving laughter, Kale's stomach turned to ice, because he knew exactly who held the top of the lower rank, and he remembered watching that boy crush skulls in the duel circle for sport. The rank's champion was a thick-necked, golden-haired bully named Doran Vale, the 3rd son of a sword baron, and as the laughter spread, Doran pushed to the front of the crowd, and looked Kale up and down the way a wolf regards a lamb, his grin promising a long, public, humiliating beating. Kale stood very still under the weight of every staring eye, his frail chest rising and falling, and he understood that Sarah Dolan had not set this duel as punishment but as an experiment. She wanted to see whether the impossible thing she had glimpsed would surface again under real violence, or shatter like the runt everyone believed him to be. The morning bell released the cadets to their chores, and Kale walked alone to the cliff edge above the surf, the wind howling, and there he flexed the borrowed hands he no longer trusted and ran the brutal calculation of the coming duel. Doran was 3 times his strength and would close fast, swing wide, and try to overwhelm, exactly as 100 forgotten brutes had tried against him before. He could not win on power. The boy's body simply did not have it, and any attempt to trade blows would end with his skull on the flagstones. So he did what he had always done when outmatched in his first life. He turned his weakness into a trap and began, in the cold privacy of his mind, to build the duel backward from the single instant where Doran would be off balance. For the hours before noon, he found a quiet corner of the cloister gallery, half hidden in shadow, and there he drilled not strength but timing, swinging the chipped practice sword in slow, exact arcs until the weak muscles screamed, mapping the precise distance at which a charging bull of a boy commits his weight past the point of return. A younger cadet found him there, a wiry, sharp-eyed girl named Liz with ink-stained fingers, and a scribe's satchel, the rank's lowest born and its unofficial keeper of gossip, and she watched him drill with frank curiosity before telling him bluntly that he was going to die, because no one survived a noon duel against Doran without being carried out. Kale paused mid-swing and looked at her, and for a moment the veteran behind his young eyes surfaced fully, and he told her quietly that dying was a habit he had recently broken. A strange answer that made the girl laugh in surprise and then fall oddly silent, because the runt had said it with the certainty of a man who had counted his own death and found it overrated. Noon came gray and cold, and the lower yard filled to its tiered benches with cadets eager for blood, while a white chalk duel circle was drawn across the cracked flagstones, and the sea wind carried the smell of salt and old stone over the gathered crowd. Sarah Dolan took her place on the dais, arms folded, her amber gaze fixed not on the cheering mass but on the small gray figure stepping into the chalk, and Kale felt the weight of her attention like a blade laid flat against his neck, a watcher who already suspected he was more than he seemed. Doran swaggered into the circle from the opposite side, spinning his heavier practice blade, playing to the crowd, and when he finally faced Kale his grin widened at the sight of the runt's trembling stance. Trembling because Kale was letting the body's weakness show, baiting the contempt he needed his opponent to feel. The instructor's hand dropped, and Doran charged exactly as Kale had known he would, a roaring downhill avalanche of muscle and momentum, the heavy blade rising for a blow that could crack back ribs. And Kale did not retreat, which was the one thing no sane runt would ever do. At the precise instant Doran committed his full weight into the swing. Kale stepped not back but diagonally inside the arc, so close he could smell the bigger boy's breath, and let the wild blade hiss past his ear while his own chipped sword tapped, almost gently, against the inside of Doran's leading knee. It was not a strong blow. The weak body could not deliver one, but it landed on a joint already overcommit, and Doran's own charging momentum did the rest, folding his leg the wrong way and pitching the sword baron's son face first into the chalk in a heap of flailing limbs while the yard fell into stunned, total silence. Kale stepped back to the circle's edge, breathing hard, his thin arms shaking from the effort the maneuver had cost his frail muscles, and he looked down at the sprawled bully with neither triumph nor mercy, only the flat assessment of a man checking whether a downed enemy would rise. The silence broke into an uproar, disbelief, outrage, a few scattered odd shouts, and Doran scrambled up red-faced with humiliation and lunged again, all technique abandoned, and Kale, who had expected exactly this loss of control, guided the second wild swing past him and let the boy stumble into the benches to a roar of cruel laughter from his own faction. From the dais Sarah Dolan did not laugh. She watched the runt stand his ground in the center of the circle, watched him refuse to press an advantage he was too weak to keep, watched him manage the duel like a man rationing water in a desert, and the cold certainty grew in her that this child fought with a mind decades older than his face. She called the duel before Doran could humiliate himself a third time, declaring it a draw to spare her champion's pride, but the lie fooled no one in the yard, and as the cadets dispersed in a buzz of frightened gossip, the legend of the runt who had put Doran Vale in the dirt began to spread through Velgard like a crack racing across ice. That night Kale lay in his straw bunk staring at the damp ceiling, his abused muscles throbbing, and he allowed himself a single grim satisfaction before the worry returned. He had survived, but he had drawn the eyes of an instructor sharp enough to be deadly, and in his old life it had been exactly such attention that got dangerous boys quietly disappeared into the undervaults. He knew he had perhaps days before someone with real power decided to investigate the anomaly he represented, and so he lay awake doing what he did best, planning, mapping the academy's hierarchy from memory, which instructors were ambitious, which cadets would matter, and which sealed gate in the cliff wall must never be allowed to open as it had in the future he carried. The North Breach. He let the name settle in his mind like a stone in still water, the rusted gate in the cliff where, in 19 years' time, the riftfall would tear the world apart and birth the monsters that had eventually killed him. And he understood that everything he did here, every rank he climbed, every ally he made, was ultimately in service of reaching that gate with the power to seal it for good. But power took years to build even for a prodigy, and the boy's body was a cage of weak flesh, so Kale made his strategy patient and merciless. He would climb the ascent hall plinth by plinth, gather the few people worth saving, and let everyone underestimate the runt until the day underestimating him became fatal. The next morning a summons reached his cell before the dawn bell. A folded slip of parchment slid under the door bearing a seal he recognized with a jolt of unease. Not Sarah Dolan's mark, but the sigil of the disciplinary proctor, the academy's internal hunter of cadets who broke the rules or hid forbidden talents. The disciplinary proctor's office sat in a windowless turret reached by a tight spiral stair, and as Kale climbed through the torchlit gloom, he felt the old battlefield wariness coil in his gut, because in his memory this same office had been where troublesome cadets were quietly broken and sent home or worse. The proctor was a soft-spoken, round man named Brevin with mild eyes and ink-stained cuffs, and he invited Kale to sit across a desk buried in cadet records, and the very mildness of him set every instinct Kale owned on edge, because the most dangerous predators he had ever known had always smiled before they cut. Brevin praised the runt's surprising performance in the duel circle, then slid a single old report across the desk, and Kale's blood chilled as he read his own name attached to a list of failures, a record of a boy who had been bottom of every class for 2 years, a record that did not match a cadet who could read and unmake a charging champion. The proctor asked gently how a cadet with such a record had suddenly fought like a veteran, and Kale felt the trap close. To claim sudden talent was implausible, to claim training was checkable, and to claim a fluke insulted a man who had clearly already decided it was no fluke. So Kale chose the only move left to a cornered swordsman. The truth bent just enough to survive. He said the near death of the duel had shaken something loose in him, that he had simply stopped being afraid, and that fearlessness, not skill, had let his body move correctly for once. Brevin smiled at that, an expression that did not reach his mild eyes, and remarked that fear was the only thing keeping most cadets alive, and that a boy who had lost his fear was either about to become very great or very dead, and he would be watching closely to see which, a promise that landed in the room like a dropped blade. Kale left the turret with his heart pounding, and a new name name added to his private list of threats. And as he descended the spiral stair, he understood that survival here would not come from hiding his talent forever, which was impossible, but from controlling exactly how and when it was revealed, feeding the watchers a story they could accept. He spent the following weeks playing a careful game in the lower yard, winning his drills cleanly but never spectacularly, losing the occasional bout on purpose to dull suspicion, and slowly, painfully, rebuilding the borrowed body through brutal private training on the storm-lashed cliff ledges where no one watched. Each dawn before the bell, he ran the cliff stair until his legs gave out. Each dusk, he drilled the simplified forms 1,000 times in the shadowed cloister, and though progress was agonizingly slow, he could feel the weak frame beginning to answer him. The grip steadying, the wind no longer tearing the breath from his lungs so easily. The wiry scribe girl Liz took to shadowing him, drawn by the mystery of the runt who refused to die, and she became his first true ally in this second life, trading him the academy's secrets, which instructors feuded, which cadets were noble spies, for nothing more than the strange thrill of betting on a boy everyone else had written off. Through Liz, he learned that the Ascent Hall trials were approaching, the formal climb where lower cadets dueled for the right to mount the spiral of ranked plinths and rise from the bottom, and Kale recognized this as his first real ladder. Every plinth climbed was a step closer to the strength he would need at the North Breach. He also learned, with a cold thrill of recognition, that the Academy's headmaster was a name from his nightmares. Archmaster Vaon, the man who, in the future timeline, would seal the North Breach too late and too weakly. The proud fool whose arrogance Kale blamed for the end of the world. Vaon was not yet the doomed old man of Kale's memory, but a powerful blade sage at the height of his strength. And Kale understood that to change the future, he would eventually have to either win this man's trust or break his authority. And neither path was open to a runt with a hemp rank cord, which meant the climb came first. On the eve of the ascent trials, Kale stood at the base of the great vertical chamber, and looked up the dizzying spiral of plinths vanishing into the gloom far above. Each stone pillar bearing the carved name plaque of a ranked cadet, and the sheer height of the climb pressed down on him like a physical weight. He found his own name nowhere on the spiral, of course. The unranked began at the floor, and to earn even the lowest plinth, he would have to defeat a ranked cadet in the trial circle the next morning. And the cadet he had been assigned to challenge was no clumsy bully, but a precise, cold-eyed swordsman 2 ranks above the lower yard. Dawn broke over the ascent hall in shafts of pale light that fell through high slit windows, and the trial circle at the chamber's floor filled with watching cadets, while Kale stood in the cold, flexing the borrowed hands that were finally, slowly, beginning to obey him. His opponent was a lean upper cadet named Castor, all clean angles and contemptuous calm, a true student of the Academy's formal style, and he saluted Kale with the bored courtesy a noble shows a peasant before stepping on him in the trial circle. Kale studied the way Castor held his blade and felt the old recognition kindle. This was a textbook fighter, beautiful and predictable, the kind of opponent his first life had taught him to dismantle by attacking the one place textbooks never defended. The spaces between the forms. The signal dropped, and Castor opened with a flawless probing sequence, each strike a page from the Academy manual. And Kale gave ground in the chalk circle, reading the rhythm, letting the upper cadet believe the runt was merely retreating in fear before a superior style. Then the silver ring of focus sharpened in Kale's pale eyes, and on the 4th repetition of Castor's pattern, he stopped retreating and stepped into the half-beat gap between 2 textbook strikes, a gap no formal duelist ever guarded, and laid his chipped blade flat against Castor's throat before the upper cadet had finished his form. The ascent hall went utterly silent, and Castor stood frozen with a runt's practice sword at his neck, his face draining of color as he understood he had been beaten not by strength but by something far more frightening, a mind that had seen entirely through the only way of fighting he knew. Kale lowered the blade and stepped back, his thin chest heaving, and the silence shattered into a roar as a stunned proctor declared the trial his. And high on the spiral of plinths, a single carved plaque was struck blank and recut, the name of the runt rising for the first time from the chamber floor. But Kale felt no joy, only the cold awareness of how many eyes now tracked him, because beating a bully was a joke, while beating a formal upper cadet in his own style was a statement, and statements in Velgard drew the attention of people who made cadets vanish. That evening, as he climbed the cliff stair to his cell, a shadow detached from the cloister gallery and fell into step beside him. Instructor Sarah Dolan, her black coat snapping in the wind, her amber eyes unreadable, her presence at his side a silent summons he did not dare refuse. She walked him to the cliff's edge above the crashing surf and, without preamble, told him she had reviewed his record, his impossible duels and his lies, and that she had reached a single conclusion she now wanted him to confirm, that he was not the boy whose name he wore. Kale's heart slammed against his ribs, and for a long, dangerous moment he weighed every escape and found none, because this woman had hunted the truth like a swordsman swordsman hunts an opening, and she had cornered him on a cliff edge with the sea at his back and her real long sword at her hip. So he gave her a sliver of the truth wrapped in a lie she could use. He said he had been broken once, so completely that he had come back wrong, with knowledge he could not explain and skills that frightened even him, and that he wanted only to climb high enough that no one could break him again. Sarah Dolan studied him in the dying light, the hooked scar stark on her cheek, and at last she said that she did not believe his explanation, but that she did believe his hunger, and that hunger was the one thing she could teach, and she offered, against every rule, to train the runt herself. Kale understood instantly that her offer was a cage as much as a gift, that under her tutelage she could watch him constantly, control his rise, and break him the moment he became a threat, and he also understood that refusing her was impossible. So he bowed his head and accepted the leash, already planning how to slip it. So began the hardest months of his second life, training before dawn and after dusk under the harshest blade master in Velgard, who drove the weak body to its breaking point and beyond, and who watched his every flinch and recovery with the patient attention of a woman waiting for a mask to crack. Sarah's training yard was a private terrace cut into the cliff, swept by sea spray, and there she stripped Kale's borrowed body down to its foundations, forcing him to rebuild every motion under her hawkish eye until his muscles wove the master's instincts back into young flesh. She noticed at once that he already knew things he should not, that his footwork hid depths his strength could not yet express, and rather than expose him, she fed those depths, sharpening the swordsman trapped in the runt's frame because, Kale slowly realized, she wanted to see how far the anomaly would go. In the rare moments she let him rest, Kale studied her in turn, and he remembered fragments from his first life. That Instructor Dolan had died early in the Riftfall, holding the North Breach stair alone so others could flee, a sacrifice that had bought minutes and saved no one. The memory changed how he saw the cold woman driving him to exhaustion, and a quiet resolve formed beneath his strategy. Whatever else he rewrote, he would not let her die for nothing on that doomed stair, and so he began, carefully, to make himself worth saving and her worth keeping alive. Liss, meanwhile, became Kale's eyes throughout the academy, and through her network of scribes and servants, he tracked the slow currents of power above him. Archmaster Vaon's growing obsession with the sealed breach, the rival instructors jockeying beneath him, and a faction of older cadets who whispered of forbidden strength in the undervaults. That last rumor pricked Kale's memory like a needle, because he recalled that in his first life the undervaults had hidden a corrupting power, a black water that promised strength, and devoured the cadets who drank it, and that this same corruption had been the first crack through which the Riftfall later spread. He resolved to map the undervaults himself, and one moonless night he and Liss descended the flooded catacombs beneath the academy by a forgotten servant's stair, torchlight guttering on dripping black stone, the air thick with salt and something older and fouler beneath it. The deeper they went, the more the walls changed, the honest granite giving way to a glassy black rock veined with faint sickly light, and Kale's old battlefield instincts screamed that they had crossed into something tainted long before the future he remembered, that the corruption was already here, patient, waiting. In a flooded gallery far below the sea line they found a ring of older cadets kneeling around a pool of utterly black water, drinking from cupped hands, their eyes gone wide and glassy, their bodies trembling with a strength that was not their own. And Kale recognized the first seed of the catastrophe. He pulled Liss back into the shadows, his heart cold, because he understood now that the Riftfall had not begun 19 years in the future at all. It had begun here, in this pool, in this slow corruption of ambitious cadets, and that the timeline he remembered had been the end of a rot that was starting right now beneath his feet. One of the kneeling cadets rose, and the black water steamed off his skin, and his eyes found Kale in the dark with an inhuman swiftness, and in a voice layered with something that was not human he asked whether the runt had come to drink or to die, and the corrupted cadet drew a blade slick with shadow. Kale shoved Liss toward the servant's stair and shouted at her to run, and then he turned to face a thing wearing a cadet's body, a creature far stronger than his weak frame could overcome, in a flooded catacomb where no instructor would ever hear him scream. The corrupted cadet attacked with a speed and power no living student should possess, the shadow-slick blade carving the torchlit dark, and Kale survived the first exchange only because 40 years of war had taught his mind to move long before his body could, reading the inhuman strikes by instinct alone. But reading was not enough against such strength, and a backhand blow caught his shoulder and hurled him into the black pool, the corrupting water closing over his head, cold and hungry and whispering promises of power into his drowning mind. Drink and never be weak again. For one terrible heartbeat the temptation was real, because Kale knew exactly how weak this body was and exactly how much the black strength would give him, and he hung suspended in the foul water with the easy answer pouring into his ears. And then he remembered the dead city, the red snow, and the monsters that this very power would one day become. He kicked upward and burst from the black pool spitting the foul water, refusing the gift even as his weak body screamed for it. And the refusal itself seemed to enrage the corrupted cadet, who came on with a shriek that no human throat should make, blade raised for a killing blow. Kale could not match its strength, so he did the only thing left. He stopped trying to survive and chose instead to spend everything in a single perfect motion, slipping inside the creature's wild swing and driving his chipped practice sword not at its body but at the slick blade itself, shattering the corrupted weapon against the stone. The thing recoiled, suddenly disarmed, and in that flicker of imbalance Kale drove his shoulder into its knee exactly as he had felled Doran, and the creature crashed into the black pool that had birthed it, thrashing, while Kale hauled himself up the servant's stair on hands and knees, lungs burning, the foul water dripping from him into the dark. He collapsed at the top of the stair beside the trembling figure of Liz, who had not fled after all but waited with a stolen torch and terror in her ink-stained face, and together they sealed the forgotten door with a fallen beam, the shrieking from below slowly fading into the drip of black water. For a long time neither of them spoke, crouched in the cold servant's passage, and then Liz asked in a shaking whisper what that thing had been, and Kale, still dripping, told her the only truth that mattered, that it had once been a cadet, that something beneath the academy was turning students into monsters, and that no one above them would believe a runt and a scribe. He swore Liz to silence, not to protect himself but because he knew exactly how the powerful would respond to such a warning from the powerless. They would investigate, blunder, and crack the seal wider, exactly as Archmaster Vaon would one day do at the North Breach, and the corruption would spread faster, not slower. So Kale made a colder choice than any 16-year-old should. He would say nothing yet, climb faster, and gather the strength and the standing to deal with the undervaults himself before the rot could spread, even if that meant carrying the secret of the black pool alone through every duel and trial to come. The decision aged something in his pale eyes, and Liz saw it, and from that night she stopped treating him as a curiosity and began treating him as something closer to a commander, a boy who carried a weight she could only guess at, who had walked into the dark and come back colder and more certain. In the weeks that followed, Kale's climb up the ascent hall accelerated, each trial duel won by the same impossible reading of his opponents, each victory raising his name plaque another turn up the spiral, while the corrupted secret burned quietly in his chest like a swallowed coal. He defeated a brawling CliffClan cadet who fought like a landslide, slipping the boy's crushing blows and turning his own weight against him in the chalk circle until the larger cadet sprawled exhausted and beaten beneath the watching tears of the hall. He outlasted a patient defensive duelist who had never lost a trial, drawing the man into a war of stamina that the runt should have lost 100 times over, until Kale's veteran discipline outlasted the older cadet's body and the defensive master yielded in disbelief. With each rise, the academy's attention sharpened, and the whispers changed from mockery to unease, from the runt who got lucky to the runt who could not be beaten, and Kale felt a dangerous shift in how people looked at him. No longer prey, but a problem the powerful would eventually decide to solve. Sarah Dolan drove him harder still, and under her brutal tutelage the borrowed body finally crossed a threshold, the weak frame thickening into lean, corded muscle, the grip steadying into something that could at last begin to express the swordsman his mind remembered being, and the bronze rank cord replaced the hemp at his collar. That night, on her wind-scoured terrace, Sarah marked the change in him with a rare, grudging respect, and she told him that strength alone had never been what set the great swordsman apart, but the willingness to keep standing when the body screamed to fall. Kale listened, watching the sea churn black below, and recognized in her flat words the same brutal truth that 40 years of war had carved into him, that survival was a discipline, not a gift, and that the dead had simply been those who sat down one moment too soon. For a heartbeat, the two of them stood in companionable silence above the surf, mentor and impossible student, and Kale felt something he had not allowed himself since the red snow, the dangerous warmth of a comrade at his side, and the cold fear of one more person the deep might take from him. The morning he earned the bronze cord, Kale stood before the spiral of plinths, and looked up at how far he had risen and how impossibly far he still had to climb, and for the first time he let himself believe that the future was not fixed, that the dead city of red snow could be unmade if he simply refused to stop climbing. That fragile hope lasted exactly until the academy bells rang an alarm no cadet had heard in a generation, a deep, frantic tolling that rolled down through the cliff and froze the blood of everyone who heard it, because that bell was rung only when a cadet had died, and Kale, sprinting toward the sound, already feared he knew which dark place the body had come from. The alarm bell drew the whole academy to the lower yard, where instructors had laid a sheet over a small, still shape on the cracked flagstones, and Kale pushed through the murmuring crowd with dread coiling in his chest, until he glimpsed beneath the sheet's edge a hand stained black to the wrist. The dead cadet was one of the kneeling figures from the undervault pool, found dried and hollow at at the bottom of a cliff stair as though something had drunk him from the inside out. And only Kale understood that the black water had finally taken what it was owed. The first open victim of a rot no one else could see. Archmaster Vaon himself descended to examine the body, a tall iron-gray figure radiating power. And Kale saw at once that the future tyrant of his memory was here, a proud and brilliant man who looked at the blackened corpse and saw a mystery to be conquered rather than a warning to be heeded. Vaon declared the death a tragic accident, a cadet who had fallen experimenting with forbidden tonics, and ordered the matter closed. And watching the Archmaster's certain, dismissive face, Kale felt a cold confirmation that this man's arrogance would one day end the world exactly as he remembered, unless someone forced him to truly see. That night Kale could not sleep, turning the impossible problem over in his mind. The corruption was spreading faster than the future he remembered. The authorities would not act, and a bronze-cord cadet had no standing to challenge an Archmaster's ruling without being silenced as a hysteric or a heretic. He resolved to find the source of the black water itself, not merely the pool but the deeper wound it leaked from, because in his first life the riftfall had poured from the north breach, and if the same corruption was already seeping into the undervaults, then the two had to be connected far below the Academy's foundations. Over the following weeks, in stolen hours between Sarah's brutal training and the relentless ascent trials, Kale and Liss mapped the catacombs from a safe distance, charting the spread of the glassy black rock by the sickly veins of light that crept further through the granite with each passing month. The map told a terrible story. The corruption was advancing from a single point deep in the cliff, climbing toward the Academy like rising damp, and when Kale overlaid it with his memory of the Academy's structure, his blood ran cold, because the source lay directly beneath the sealed north breach. The breach and the undervault rot were one wound, slowly opening from the bottom up, and the riftfall he remembered had merely been the moment the wound finally tore through to the surface, which meant the catastrophe had no fixed date at all, only a steady creep that any blunder could accelerate into collapse. This knowledge changed everything about Kale's plan, because patience was no longer safe. Every month he climbed, the rot climbed with him, and the careful decades-long ascent he had imagined was a luxury the spreading corruption would not grant him. He drove himself harder, rising through the ascent hall ranks at a pace that turned the Academy's unease into something like fear, his name plaque spiraling upward past cadets twice his size, each trial duel won by the same uncanny reading that made stronger opponents feel as though they fought a mirror that knew them better than they knew themselves. The faster he climbed, the more enemies he made, and the upper cadets, proud, well-born, and humiliated by a bronze-cord runt, began to close ranks against him, no longer in the honest chalk of the trial circle, but in whispered plots and arranged accidents on the cliff stairs. The first attempt came on a storm-black night, 3 upper cadets ambushing Kale on a narrow ledge above the surf, expecting to throw a runt into the sea and call it a slip, but they had ambushed the wrong boy, and 40 years of surviving exactly such treachery had taught Kale to feel a knife before it left its sheath. He took the ledge with his back to the cliff so the 3 could not flank him, let the storm's roar mask his movements, and dismantled the ambush not with strength he did not have but with leverage and the narrow ground, sending 2 of his attackers sprawling and the 3rd fleeing into the rain before any blade drew blood. But Kale let them flee deliberately, because dead conspirators would bring instructors and questions, while live, humiliated ones would carry a warning back to whoever had sent them. And as he watched the last attacker vanish into the storm, he understood the Academy's true game had finally begun, the powerful testing whether the runt could be quietly removed. The next morning Sarah Dolan found the bruises on Kale's forearms during training and went very still, the hooked scar on her cheek whitening, and without a word she changed his lessons from dueling to killing. The difference, she told him flatly, between sport and survival, a difference she had learned the hard way and would not let him learn too late. She taught him the brutal economies the Academy manuals omitted, how to end a fight before it began, how to make an enemy's strength his grave. And Kale absorbed it all with a hunger that unsettled even her, because she was teaching a 16-year-old things she had assumed she was the only one cruel enough to know. One evening, after he disarmed her 3 times in a row, a feat no cadet had achieved in years, Sarah lowered her longsword and asked him outright, in the salt wind on her private terrace, who he truly was, because no broken boy moved like a man who had buried more comrades than she had ever commanded. Kale looked at the woman he was determined to save and made a decision that could destroy him. He told her a fragment of the impossible truth, that he carried the memory of a war that had not happened yet, a war that began beneath their feet and ended with the world in red snow, and that he had come back to stop it. He braced for her to call him mad, to march him to the proctor, to draw the blade at her hip, but Sarah Dolan only stood in the dying light and studied him for a long, terrible moment, and then she said quietly that she had felt a cold rising from the undervaults for 2 years and told herself it was was nothing, and that she would rather follow a madman who saw the rot than a wise man who denied it. In that moment Kale gained his first true ally with real power, and the weight he had carried alone since the Blackpool eased a fraction, because instructor Sarah Dolan, harshest blade in Velgard, the woman who in another life died alone on the breach stair, now knew the shape of the enemy and chose to stand with the runt against it. Together they made a quiet pact to climb and to prepare, to gather what allies they could trust and to study the spreading rot without alerting the Archmaster, whose arrogance would only widen the wound. And Kale felt for the first time that the future he remembered had truly begun to bend. But allies bred enemies, and a bronze cord cadet training privately with the Academy's most feared instructor did not go unnoticed, and the upper cadets' resentment curdled into something organized, a clandestine society of well-born students who called themselves the Crucible and who believed strength was a birthright the runt was stealing. Kale learned of the Crucible through Liss, whose network of scribes and servants heard everything, and with cold recognition he realized that this society was no mere clique of bullies. Its members were the same ambitious cadets drawn to whispers of forbidden strength, the exact population the Blackpool of the Undervaults was hunting. The corruption, he understood, did not spread at random. It preyed on hunger and pride, on cadets desperate enough to drink from a black pool for the power to rise. And the Crucible, gathering the Academy's most ambitious students into one proud brotherhood, was nothing less than a feeding trough the rot was cultivating from below. This insight chilled Kale to the bone, because it meant the corruption was not merely spreading but choosing, drawing its future victims together, and that the catastrophe he remembered had been engineered from the start by something patient enough to wait 19 years and clever enough to use the Academy's own ambition against it. He needed to understand what that something was, and so he turned to the one place that might hold answers, the Academy's sealed archive, a tower vault of forbidden histories that only ranked Silver Cord cadets could enter, which meant Kale had to climb 3 more ranks before the rot climbed high enough to choose its final victims. The race tightened, and Kale threw himself into the ascent trials with a ferocity that turned each duel into a small war, climbing the spiral of plinths past Iron Cord cadets who had trained twice his lifetime, until his name hung more than halfway up the great vertical chamber, and the whole Academy spoke of the runt who would not stop rising. Then, on the day he won his Iron Cord, the corruption made its first open move. 3 more cadets vanished in a single night, and this time no blackened bodies were found at all. Only empty bunks and a faint reek of salt and rot drifting up from the lower stairs, as though the undervaults had simply swallowed them whole. Archmaster Vaon, his certainty finally shaken, ordered the lower catacombs sealed and forbade all cadets from descending. Exactly the blundering response Kale had feared, because sealing the rot's known entrances did nothing to stop a wound opening from below and only blinded the Academy to how fast it now spread. Kale knew sealing the stairs was a death sentence in slow motion, and he confronted Sarah on her wind-scoured terrace with the truth that the Archmaster was repeating years early the exact fatal mistake that had doomed the world he remembered, treating a living wound as a door that could simply be shut. Sarah agreed, her amber eyes hard, but reminded him of the brutal political reality that they had no proof an Archmaster would accept, that a runt and a single instructor could not openly defy Vaon without being destroyed, and that the only currency the Academy respected was rank and demonstrated power. So Kale set his jaw and named his next goal aloud, the Silver Cord, and with it entry to the sealed archive where the Academy's oldest records might explain what truly slept beneath the North Breach, and how the corruption had first been bound, and therefore how it might be bound again before it tore free. The climb to silver demanded more trials than any before it, and Kale threw himself into a punishing routine, hauling his lean frame up the cliff stair before dawn and drilling Sarah's killing economies after dusk, until the storm-gray sea blurred gray-black and his arms refused to lift the blade one more time. In the cloister gallery, hidden in shadow, Liss kept him company through the worst of those nights, and one storm-lashed evening she finally told him her own story, that she was the orphaned daughter of a fallen scribe house kept at Velgard on charity, mocked for her ink-stained fingers and her lack of any noble blade. She confessed, her sharp eyes wet in the torchlight, that she had bet on the runt not for thrill, but because he was the only person in the whole Black Fortress who had ever looked at her as though she mattered. And Kale, who had buried too many who mattered, swore quietly that whatever came, he would not let the deep take her. That vow steadied something in them both, and from that night Liss's gossip became true intelligence, mapping the Crucible's membership, its meeting places, and the slow drift of its proudest members toward the sealed lower stairs. A list, Kale realized with a chill, of the corruption's chosen larder. The Crucible answered his rise with open contempt, and a sneering Iron Cord cadet named Halvarin, the society's enforcer, challenged Kale to a trial duel meant to break the upstart publicly, and halt his climb one rank short of the silver and the archive it unlocked. Halvarin was a brutal, intelligent fighter, nothing like the Bull Doran or the textbook Castor, a swordsman who had clearly studied Kale's victories and come to the chalk circle determined to deny the runt the gaps and rhythms his style preyed upon. Fighting cautious and broken tempo from the first signal. For the first time in his second life, Kale faced an opponent who refused to be read, and the Ascent Hall held its breath as the duel stretched long and grinding, Halvarin giving no rhythm to exploit, no overcommitment to punish, only patient pressure meant to wear the smaller cadet down. But Kale had not survived 40 years of war by relying on a single trick, and when reading failed, he fell back on the oldest lesson of all, that a fighter who refuses to commit also refuses to win, and that patience, pressed long enough, curdles into the very impatience it was meant to avoid. So Kale did nothing, frustrating the enforcer with a defense so economical it cost him almost nothing, letting the long minutes drag until Halvarin, mindful of the watching crucible and his own pride, finally abandoned caution and lunged. And in that single committed instant, the silver ring sharpened and the duel ended. Kale slipped the lunge and laid his iron-cord blade across the enforcer's wrist. The disarm so clean Halvarin's sword spun away across the chalk before he understood he had lost, and the Ascent Hall roared as the crucible's enforcer stood empty-handed before the runt he had sworn to break. The victory carried Kale to the threshold of the silver rank, but it also marked him, openly now, as the crucible's enemy, and as he left the trial circle he felt the cold weight of the society's hatred settle on his back like a second cloak, and somewhere among the watching upper cadets, a fair golden head turned away in silent fury. The path to silver ran through the crucible, for its leader held one of the highest plinths in the Ascent Hall, a cold and brilliant upper cadet named Ardent Sail, the Academy's golden prodigy, beloved by instructors, and destined, everyone said, to become the youngest blade master in Velgard's history. Kale remembered the name from his first life with a jolt, because Ardent Sail had not become a blade master at all. He had become one of the first great horrors of the Riftfall, a corrupted swordsman of terrible power who had slaughtered his way through the fleeing students before Kale himself had finally cut him down in the ruins. The knowledge sat heavy in Kale's chest as he watched Ardent from across the Ascent Hall, a tall, fair young man with an easy smile and flawless form, beloved and brilliant, with no idea that the black pool below was already reaching for him, that his very perfection made him the corruption's chosen prize. For a moment Kale considered whether saving Ardent might be possible, whether the golden prodigy could be turned from his fate as Sarah had been. But he remembered the thing in the flooded gallery, the cadet who had drunk and become inhuman, and he understood that some lines, once crossed, could not be walked back. To reach the silver cord and the archive, Kale would have to challenge and defeat Ardent Sail in the Ascent trial, dethroning the Academy's golden son in front of everyone, a victory that would make him either the most respected cadet in Velgard or the most hated, and almost certainly the corruption's next target. He spent a month preparing, not only his body, which had grown lean and dangerous under Sarah's brutal teaching, but his mind, studying every recorded duel Ardent had ever fought through Lissa's stolen records, mapping the prodigy's flawless style for the single flaw that flawlessness always hides. And he found it, as he had known he would, because Ardent Sail had never truly been pushed, never been hurt, never fought a battle he might lose. His perfection was the perfection of a blade that has only ever cut soft things, and Kale had spent 40 years breaking exactly such blades against the hard edge of real war. The day of the challenge dawned bright and cold, and the Ascent Hall filled to its highest galleries, instructors and cadets alike crowding the spiral plinths to watch the impossible. A runt who had begun on the chamber floor challenging the golden prodigy for one of the highest ranks in the Academy. Archmaster Vayon himself attended, seated high above the trial circle, his iron-gray presence a weight on the whole chamber, and Kale felt the man's gaze settle on him with cold curiosity, the doomed tyrant of the future studying the boy who would one day either save him or replace him. Ardent Sail saluted with his easy, gracious smile, a prince humoring a peasant, and the entire hall expected the golden son to teach the upstart his place in a few clean strokes. But Kale saw the faint flicker behind that smile, the first uncertainty of a young man who had finally met an opponent he could not read. The signal dropped, and Ardent opened with the flawless cascade of forms that had made his name, each strike a masterpiece, and the hall roared its approval as the prodigy drove the runt back across the chalk. But Kale was not retreating in fear, he was reading, letting the perfect sequence wash over him while the silver ring of focus sharpened in his pale eyes. On the seventh form Kale stopped giving ground, and the hall's roar died into a held breath as the runt stepped into a gap that should not have existed, inside the prodigy's flawless rhythm. And for the first time in his charmed life Ardent Sail felt cold iron rest against his ribs before he had finished his attack. Ardent leapt back, his smile gone, and for the first time the hall saw the golden prodigy rattled. His breathing quickened, his perfect calm cracked shocked by the impossible fact that a runt had touched him, and stung pride drove him to abandon his beautiful forms for raw, furious aggression. This was exactly what Kale had wanted, because a prodigy who has never lost does not know how to fight while afraid, and Ardent's fury made his flawless technique ragged, opening gaps that the controlled Blade Master never would have shown. Gaps a veteran of 40 years war read as easily as words on a page. Kale wove through the storm of furious strikes, never matching power for power, always a half-beat ahead, redirecting the prodigy's own momentum until Ardent was lunging at shadows and striking at where the runt had been. The whole Ascent Hall watching in stunned silence as the golden sun was slowly, methodically unmade. The end came clean and merciless. Kale let Ardent overcommit to a desperate killing thrust, slipped it by a hair, and laid his iron cord blade flat across the prodigy's throat with the unhurried certainty of a man who had ended 1,000 such moments. And the chamber froze in absolute, disbelieving silence. For 3 heartbeats, no one breathed. The golden prodigy stood defeated with a runt's blade at his neck, and then the Ascent Hall erupted. Some in awe, some in fury, the Crucible faction roaring betrayal. While high above, Archmaster Vaon leaned forward with an expression Kale could not read, fascination and calculation warring on his iron-gray face. Kale lowered his blade and stepped back, offering Ardent neither mockery nor pity, only the flat respect of one swordsman to another. And he watched the prodigy's face cycle through shock and shame and something darker, a hatred that had never existed in the golden sun until the moment a runt showed him he could lose. In that hatred Kale saw the seed of the monster Ardent would become, and his heart sank, because he understood that, by defeating the prodigy, he had not saved him from corruption but had perhaps pushed him toward it, planting in the broken golden sun exactly the desperate hunger the Black Pool was built to exploit. The trial was declared, and Kale's name plaque was struck and recut near the top of the great spiral, the silver thread now bright at his collar, and the runt who had begun on the chamber floor stood among the highest cadets in Velgard. But the victory tasted of ash, because he had won the silver cord at the cost of pushing his future enemy one step closer to ruin. That night, alone in his cell with the silver cord in his hands, Kale wrestled with the brutal arithmetic of changing fate, that every action rippled, that saving one person might damn another, that the future was not a fixed wall to be torn down but a living thing that twisted under his hands in ways he could not always predict. But the silver cord opened the sealed archive, and the next morning Kale climbed the long stair to the archive tower, a vault of forbidden histories where the dust of centuries lay thick on shelves of crumbling records, and where, he hoped, the truth about the thing beneath the north breach finally waited to be found. The archive was cold and silent, lit only by the gray light of slit windows high in the tower, and Kale moved through the towering shelves with the focused patience of a man who had learned that knowledge, more than any blade, was what survived a war, searching the oldest records for any mention of the breach, the rot, or the black water below. For hours he read by the failing light, and slowly a buried history assembled itself from fragments. That Velgard Academy had not been built to train swordsmen at all, but as a prison, a fortress raised centuries ago to seal something the founders had bound beneath the cliff and named only the Sleeper in the deep. The Sleeper, the records hinted in their guarded, frightened language, was no monster but a will, an ancient hunger that could not be killed, only contained, and the Academy's entire purpose, its discipline, its strength, its endless production of swordsmen, had been to maintain a garrison strong enough to keep the binding intact across the centuries. But the founders' true purpose had been forgotten over generations. The prison mistaken for a mere school, the binding's maintenance lapsed into empty ritual, and Kale understood with dawning horror that the Riftfall had not been an attack from outside at all. It had been the Sleeper finally waking because the jailers had forgotten they were jailers. And worse, the records warned that the Sleeper could not wake on its own, that it needed a vessel, a living swordsman of extraordinary strength corrupted by the black water and offered, willingly or not, as the door through which the ancient will would pour into the world. And Kale's blood turned to ice as he understood exactly who the corruption had been grooming for that role. The vessel had to be the Academy's strongest corruptible swordsman, broken enough to hunger and proud enough to drink. And Kale sat in the cold archive with the crumbling records in his hands and faced the unbearable truth that by defeating Ardent Sail he had forged the perfect door for the Sleeper to open. He read on through the dying light, desperate now for any binding the founders had used, and found among the brittle pages a single diagram. The Academy itself was the seal, its towers and stairs and yards laid out as a vast ward, and the north breach was not a gate at all but the keystone, the one point where the binding could be renewed or broken. The records named the ritual of renewal only obliquely, a rite requiring the Academy's strongest swordsmen to stand at the breach and pour their disciplined will into the keystone, a thing done every generation in the founders' time and forgotten for a century, which meant the binding had been decaying decaying untended for 100 years. Kale closed the records with shaking hands and understood the true shape of his task at last. He did not merely need to grow strong enough to fight the riftfall when it came. He needed to restore a forgotten ritual, gather swordsmen strong and disciplined enough to perform it, and renew the keystone before the sleeper found its vessel. This was a labor far beyond a single silver-cord cadet, and the scale of it pressed down on him in the cold tower like the weight of the dead city he carried. But Kale had learned in 40 years of war that impossible tasks were simply ordinary tasks that no one had yet broken into small enough pieces. So he began to plan in earnest, and the first piece was knowledge he now possessed and the Archmaster did not. And Kale faced the dangerous question of whether to bring the truth to Vaon, the proud man whose arrogance had doomed the world, or to work around him through the quiet network he and Sarah and Liz had built. He chose, for now, to prepare in secret because he remembered too well how Vaon's pride had treated warnings, and because he needed proof an Archmaster could not dismiss. And proof meant the North Breach itself, the sealed keystone he had avoided since his return, the place where his first life's nightmare had begun. That night Kale told Sarah everything he had found, the prison beneath the school, the sleeper, the keystone, the forgotten ritual, and the harsh instructor listened in the lamplight of her terrace with a stillness that was almost grief, because she had given her life to a school whose true purpose its own masters had forgotten. When he finished, Sarah asked the only question that mattered, what they needed, and Kale answered without hesitation: strength, allies, and time, in a race against a corruption that grew faster every month, against a vessel he had perhaps already created, against an Archmaster who would not listen until it was too late. Sarah pledged him her strength and her silence, and more. She named 2 other instructors she trusted, veterans who had also felt the cold rising from the deep, and held their tongues, and Kale understood that his small conspiracy of the powerless was beginning, at last, to gather people who mattered. But even as his alliance grew, the corruption moved faster, and within a fortnight Kale's worst fear took shape. Ardent Sail, the broken golden prodigy, stopped appearing at training, withdrawing into a brooding isolation, and Lyssa's whispers reported that the prodigy had been seen near the sealed lower stairs at night, drawn toward the dark like a moth toward a black flame. Kale knew he had to reach Ardent before the black water did, and he sought the prodigy out in the cloister gallery one gray dusk, finding the golden sun staring out at the storm-gray sea with a face hollowed by shame. And Kale, against all strategy, tried to speak to him not as a rival but as a fellow swordsman who knew what it was to lose everything. He told Ardent, in careful words that hid the impossible truth, that strength bought through shortcuts was a debt that always came due, that he had seen men trade their souls for power and become things that even their friends had to cut down. But the prodigy only looked at him with that new, cold hatred and asked what a runt could possibly know of his ruin. Kale saw the door closing and made a desperate choice, telling Ardent plainly that something beneath the academy was hunting him, that the black water in the deep would offer him everything, and take everything, and that the prodigy's very strength made him its chosen prey. A warning that was perhaps the worst thing he could have said, because Ardent Sail, broken and hungry and humiliated, heard not a warning but a promise, that there existed, somewhere below, a power great enough to make him whole again, a power the runt who had unmade him clearly feared, and the cold hatred in his eyes kindled into something far more dangerous, a desperate, hungry resolve. Kale left the cloister sick with the knowledge that his clumsy warning had pushed Ardent toward the very edge he meant to pull him from, and he understood the cruel lesson of changing fate yet again. That information was a blade that cut the hand that wielded it as often as the enemy, and that some people could not be saved by the truth. That night Ardent Sail vanished, his bunk empty, the sealed lower stair found broken open from the inside, and a faint reek of salt and rot rising from the dark below. And Kale knew, with a certainty that hollowed him, that the corruption's chosen vessel had descended at last to drink from the black pool. He did not wait for the morning bell or the Archmaster's permission. He woke Sarah and her 2 trusted instructors and told them the hour had come sooner than any of them had feared, that the vessel was drinking even now, and that if they did not descend into the undervaults this very night the sleeper might wake before dawn. Sarah moved at once, gathering the small conspiracy in the lamplit dark, and the 4 of them, the harsh instructor, her 2 veteran allies, and the silver-cord runt who carried a dead future in his mind, armed themselves with real blades and descended the broken stair into the flooded catacombs, torchlight guttering on glassy black stone. The deeper they went the more the corruption had spread, the sickly veined light now pulsing through the walls like a slow heartbeat, the black water no longer pooled but flowing, rising, lapping at the ancient granite as though the whole cliff were filling with the sleeper's patient hunger from below. They found Ardent Sail in the great flooded gallery beneath the sea line, kneeling at the edge of a pool gone vast and black and steaming, and the golden prodigy was already changing, his fair skin veined with creeping shadow, his eyes drowning in darkness, his beautiful form swelling with a strength that was not his own and never could be. Kale called out to him one last desperate attempt, naming the prodigy by his true name, reminding him of the swordsman he had been before the black water. But the thing that lifted its head from the pool wore Arden's face like a mask, and the voice that answered was layered with the vast cold patience of the sleeper in the deep. It told them, in that doubled inhuman voice, that the jailers had forgotten their charge and the prison had grown thin, that it had waited 100 years for a vessel worthy of the door, and that the proud golden boy had offered himself freely for the strength to crush the runt who had shamed him. And now the door would open. Sarah and her veterans attacked without hesitation, 3 master swordsmen striking as one, but the corrupted vessel moved with the sleeper's borrowed might, and turned their blades aside like a man brushing off rain. And Kale watched in cold horror as the future he remembered began to repeat itself in the torchlit dark decades early. He saw in a flash the dead city and the red snow, saw Sarah dying on the breached stair, saw the world end, and he refused it, stepping into the black gallery with his silver cord, blade low and the silver ring of focus blazing in his pale eyes, because if he had come back for any single moment it was this one. The vessel turned its drowning eyes on Kale and laughed with 2 voices, taunting the runt who thought a borrowed boy's body could stand against an ancient will, and it came on with Arden's flawless forms now amplified by the sleeper's terrible strength, each strike a killing blow that cratered the black stone where Kale had stood a heartbeat before. Kale could not match that strength, just as he had never been able to match strength in this weak life, and so he fought the only way he had ever known, not to overpower but to read, to slip, to redirect, weaving through the vessel's devastating assault on 40 years of instinct while his allies pressed the creature from every side. He fought as he had never fought in this second life. The swordsman and the boy finally won, the master's mind and the disciplined young body moving together at last, and for a few impossible moments the 4 of them held the corrupted vessel at bay in the flooded gallery as the black water rose around their boots. But the sleeper's strength was bottomless, and one of Sarah's veterans fell, hurled into the black pool and swallowed, and the second was driven to his knees. And Kale understood with cold clarity that they could not win this fight here, that the vessel was already too strong, that the only victory left was to deny the sleeper its door before the binding broke entirely. He shouted to Sarah the truth he had read in the archive, that the creature was not the enemy but the key, that the sleeper could only enter through the keystone at the north breach, and that if they could drive the vessel away from the deep pool and toward the surface they might yet seal the keystone before the door fully opened. Sarah understood at once and changed her fight, no longer trying to kill the unkillable thing but to hurt it, the 2 surviving swordsmen and the silver cord runt working as one to drive the corrupted vessel back from the black pool and up the flooded stair toward the academy above, fighting a desperate retreat with the rising water at their heels. The vessel resisted, sensing the trap, and its fury shook the catacombs, cracks racing through the ancient granite as the sleepers will tore at the weakening binding. And Kale fought at the rear, the most exposed position, trading ground for time, every read and slip and redirection buying the seconds his allies needed to climb. They burst from the broken stair into the lower yard under a storm-black sky, the corrupted vessel howling behind them, and the alarm bells of Velgard finally woke the whole academy to the nightmare clawing up from its foundations. Cadets and instructors spilling into the yards to face a horror their masters had insisted did not exist. Archmaster Vaon descended in a fury of power, the proud iron-gray blade sage finally confronting the rot he had denied, and for the first time Kale saw the man's certainty shatter as he beheld the corrupted prodigy, and understood, far too late, that the school he ruled had always been a prison and he its negligent jailer. Kale did not waste the moment on blame. He seized the Archmaster's attention and poured out the truth in a torrent: the sleeper, the keystone, the forgotten ritual, the north breach. And Vaon, his arrogance broken by the monster before him, listened at last to the silver cord cadet he had so long underestimated. But knowing the ritual was not the same as performing it, for the rite required the Academy's strongest disciplined swordsmen to stand at the keystone and pour their unbroken will into the binding, and half the strongest cadets had already drifted toward corruption through the crucible, leaving the garrison far weaker than the founders had ever intended. The corrupted vessel surged into the yard, and the Academy's defenders threw themselves against it, instructors and senior cadets alike, and they fell like wheat before the sleeper's borrowed strength, their finest forms useless against an opponent that did not tire and did not bleed and grew stronger with every will it broke. Kale saw the battle turning into the massacre he remembered, the first chapter of the Dead City written years early in the lower yard of Velgard, and he made the only choice a man who had already died once could make. He stepped between the falling defenders and the vessel and bought them their retreat with his own body and his impossible skill. He could not win, but he did not need to win. He needed only to survive long enough to read the sleeper's borrowed forms arms and slit them to bleed the creature of seconds while Sarah and Vayon rallied the unbroken cadets and drove them up the long stair toward the north breach and the keystone that might yet be renewed. Alone in the storm-lashed yard, the runt who had begun at the bottom of the academy stood against an ancient will wearing a prodigy's flawless face, and he fought the duel of his 2 lifetimes. Every read perfect, every slip a hair's breadth from death, the silver ring blazing cold in his pale eyes as the black blade carved the rain around him. The vessel raged at the impossible runt who would not die, who turned its every killing strike aside, who fought not with strength it could break but with a mind it could not read, and in its fury it poured more of the sleeper's will into its borrowed body, growing vaster and stronger and slower, exactly as Kale had gambled it would. For a corrupted prodigy amplified by an ancient will was still, at its core, fighting with ardent sail's flawless forms. And flawlessness, Kale had learned across 40 years, was only ever a deeper kind of predictability, a pattern that grew clearer the more power was poured through it, a door that opened wider the harder it was slammed. Kale let the vessel drive him back across the yard toward the cliff stair, feigning exhaustion he genuinely felt, baiting the creature into the overwhelming killing blow that all such monsters eventually threw. And when it came, a black arc of borrowed might that could have split the cliff, Kale was no longer where it fell. He had stepped inside the swing on 40 years of instinct, so close he could see Ardent's drowning eyes, and he drove his silver cord blade not into the vessel's invulnerable body but into the seam of shadow at its throat where the prodigy's flesh met the sleeper's intrusion, the one place the founder's records had named as the door's hinge. The blade bit, and the corrupted vessel screamed with 2 voices torn suddenly apart. The sleeper's vast will and Ardent's drowning soul wrenched against each other, and for a single suspended heartbeat the prodigy's true eyes surfaced through the shadow, looking at the runt who had beaten him twice now, with something that was almost gratitude. But the sleeper's will reasserted itself, the shadow flooding back over Ardent's eyes, and the wounded vessel hurled Kale across the yard into the base of the cliff stair, the impact driving the breath from his lean body and dropping his silver cord blade ringing onto the wet stone beyond his reach. Dazed against the cold rock, the rain hammering down, Kale watched the corrupted vessel stalk toward him through the storm, its torn throat already knitting with shadow, and he understood that he had hurt the door, but not closed it, that the sleeper had merely been delayed, and that delay was the only victory he had ever truly been able to win. But delay was enough, because far above on the long cliff stair, the academy's bells had changed their tolling, and through the rain Kale heard it, the deep, resonant note of the keystone ritual beginning. Sarah and Vayon and every unbroken cadet they could rally, pouring their disciplined will into the north breach at last. The corrupted vessel froze, its drowning eyes snapping toward the cliff top, sensing the binding tighten around the deep, and the sleeper's vast cold patience cracked for the first time into something like fear, because the forgotten ritual had been remembered, the keystone was being renewed, and the door it had waited a century to open was being slowly, painfully sealed. It abandoned Kale and surged toward the stair, desperate to reach the breach before the binding closed, and Kale forced his battered body upright, snatched his fallen blade from the wet stone, and threw himself after the creature, because if it reached the ritual it would slaughter the very swordsman whose will was sealing the deep. He could not outrun the sleeper's borrowed speed, but he did not have to, he only had to make it look back. And so the runt who had begun at the bottom of the academy did the most reckless thing of either of his lives, hurling himself onto the creature's back on the rain-slick stair and driving his blade again into the wounded seam at its throat. The vessel reared and screamed and tore at him, but Kale held on with the stubbornness of a man who had already died once and found death less frightening than failure, working the blade deeper into the door's hinge while the ritual's deep note rolled down the cliff, and the binding tightened around them both like a closing fist. The sleeper, caught between the renewing keystone above and the runt tearing at its only door, made a final desperate bid. It poured the last of its will into the vessel in a surge that should have torn Ardent's body apart and flooded into the world through the breach in his throat, the catastrophe of the dead city erupting years early on a storm-black stair. But the keystone held, the unbroken will of Sarah and Vayon, and the rally cadets pressing the binding closed at the precise moment the sleeper tried to pour through, and the vast ancient hunger met the renewed seal and recoiled, with nowhere to go but back into the deep, or into the failing vessel that was its only anchor in the waking world. Kale felt the creature beneath him convulse as the sleeper's will was crushed back down, and in that final instant Ardent Sail's true face surfaced one last time through the receding shadow, and the broken prodigy, freed for a single heartbeat, did the one thing the sleeper could not. He chose, willing his own corrupted body off the edge of the cliff stair and into the storm-gray sea far below, carrying the door down with him into the dark. Kale barely flung himself clear, catching the stair's edge as the vessel plunged past him, and he watched the corrupted prodigy fall through the rain plane into the churning surf, the sleeper's anchor severed, the door drowned, and the binding above slamming fully closed with a resonant toll that rolled out across the whole cliff and then fell into a vast and sudden silence. For a long time Kale hung from the rain-slick stair above the surf, his battered body spent, his pale eyes fixed on the black water that had swallowed the prodigy who had chosen, at the very end, to be a swordsman rather than a door. And he grieved, quietly, for an enemy he had never managed to save and who had, in the last instant, saved them all. The storm broke near dawn, and Kale climbed the long stair to the north breach, where Sarah and Vayon and the surviving cadets stood exhausted around the renewed keystone. The sickly veined light gone from the granite, the cold risen from the deep finally stilled, the catastrophe of the dead city averted, for now, years before it was ever meant to begin. Archmaster Vayon, his arrogance burned away by the night's horror, looked at the silver-cord cadet who had carried the truth no one would hear, and the proud blade sage did something Kale's memory of the future had never imagined possible. He bowed deeply before the runt who had begun at the bottom of his academy, and named him the first knight of a garrison reborn. But Kale, standing at the renewed keystone in the gray dawn, felt no triumph, only the cold weight of a soldier who knows a battle won is not a war ended, because the records had named the sleeper a will that could not be killed, only contained, and the deep beneath the academy was vast, and the door had been only one of many the founders had warned of. In the days that followed, Velgard Academy changed from the inside out, the forgotten purpose of its founding restored, the keystone ritual taught openly, the crucible disbanded, and its corrupted survivors hunted through the lower catacombs by a garrison that finally understood what it guarded. And at the center of it all stood the runt with the silver cord and the ancient eyes, Sarah Dolan, who in another life had died alone and forgotten on the breach stair, stood now at Kale's side as the academy's blade mistress, the two of them training a new generation not merely to fight, but to hold the line against the patient hunger in the deep. And the future Kale remembered grew dimmer and stranger with each passing day, no longer a wall but an open road. Liz, the scribe girl who had bet on a boy everyone wrote off, became the keeper of the restored archive, hunting the founders' scattered records for every warning they had left, every door they had named, every binding that had decayed across the forgotten century. And what she found in those crumbling pages was not reassurance but a deepening dread, for the archive spoke of the North Breach as only the first and shallowest of the sleeper's doors, the keystone as only the academy's portion of a binding that spanned the whole sleeping world, and the dead city of red snow that Kale carried in his memory, as perhaps not the end of one catastrophe but the convergence of many, each opening in its own forgotten place while the jailers slept. Kale read those records by the gray light of the restored archive, and understood that he had not changed the future so much as bought it time, that the war he had died fighting still waited somewhere out in the world's forgotten corners, and that the academy alone could never hold against doors it did not even know existed. He thought of the comrades he had buried in his first life, the soldiers whose faces he still saw in the red snow, and he understood at last why he had been sent back, not merely to save one school or one timeline, but to find every door before it opened, to wake the world's forgotten garrisons while there was still time, to turn a single desperate last stand into a war the living might actually win. So Kale Varon, who had begun his second life as the weakest cadet in the lowest rank, stood one gray morning at the edge of the cliff above the storm-gray sea, with a charcoal half-cloak at his shoulders and a master's blade at his hip, looking not back at the academy he had saved but outward, toward a horizon crowded with doors no one else remembered. Sarah found him there and asked in her flat, hawkish way where he meant to go now that Velgard was secure, and Kale told her the truth he had carried since the dead city, that the rot beneath the academy had been only the nearest of many, that the war he remembered was still coming, and that he intended to find every sleeping door before the next one woke. She studied him in the salt wind, the hooked scar stark on her cheek, and then the harshest blade in Velgard did the last thing the boy he had been would ever have expected. She unslung her own longsword, set it across her shoulder, and said simply that a man hunting the world's forgotten prisons would need someone to guard his back, and that she had died once already with nothing to show for it. And so the two of them turned from the academy carved into the black cliff, and looked out at the gray dawn breaking over a world that did not yet know how thin its bindings had grown, a world full of forgotten doors and sleeping hungers, a world that the dead city had once been the end of and might yet, if they were fast enough, become the saving of. But far below the renewed keystone, in the deepest flooded dark beneath the cliff where no torch had ever reached, something that had waited 100 years felt a runt's footsteps turn toward the horizon, and the vast cold patience of the sleeper in the deep stirred, and learned his name and began, with all the time in the world, to dream of the next door it would open to greet him.